So, welcome to the Equity Series podcast produced by the Inclusive Diversity Office. I'm your host, Folarin Obikoya. Equity Series is a podcast where we explore trends, strategies, and key topics in the field of equity. So, today we have with us Andre Darmanin, HR Business Advisor, Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. Andre, welcome to the Equity Series podcast.
Thank you for Lauren. Great for me to be here today.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Andre, please tell us about your journey into the field of equity.
Well, so my journey actually starts as a what we would call a third culture kid. What I mean by that is, yes, I was born in Toronto, but I was also raised by two separate cultures, being that my mother was a Trinidadian individual and my father is Maltese. So I experienced two separate cultures growing up in social housing. I grew up for pretty much my formative years living in Lawrence Heights, which is close to the Yorkdale Shopping Center, and experiencing that type of environment, being in a multicultural environment, being in an environment where there was underprivileged. My family was considered a low middle income family, if you will, and we never owned a car. We lived by a subway station, so a lot of our travels were done by transit. Growing up through that and growing up through the challenges of economic inequities and also growing up in a biracial or multiracial household, we experienced some racism, some biases that exist, whether it was through school. I can give an example of that during high school. Me and an individual who was Italian, we were both in a certain situation, but it ended up being that I was the one who was reprimanded and the other person wasn't. And then I recall that individual down the road saying to me that you should be going to college, right? Because of your background and et cetera. And I remember hearing that and combine all of my experiences put together. This is where I want to pursue equity and more so equity, diversity, inclusion. And that was through my planning career, where I studied inequities in the transit system and how transit was developed. And through there, I've always pursued that. I'm now in the HR space. I look at it from the perspective of organizations. How do we look at equity from an organizational perspective, looking at the current policies, the current procedures, the programs that exist, and looking at that from a lens and how do we make a culture more equitable where everyone can thrive regardless of their culture or regardless of their class. That's something that I really pride myself on. And here we are now, very much into my career. And that's where I see myself being, wanting to uplift those within the OPS who have experienced the same inequities, biases, racism, etc., and looking at that from an intersectional approach. Because everyone's situations are unique. Not one situation is the same, and we need to create that equity within the OPS.
Thank you. Thank you, Andre, for taking us through that journey of your, I would say, lived experience and
Hmm.
also your professional experience in the context of working in the planning field and
Hmm.
looking at equity in transit. And now, currently, you're saying, in terms of your vision to support the creation of healthier workplaces and safer spaces, looking at it from the
Hmm.
lens of intersectionality. A lot of
Hmm.
your lived experience just describes so much of you navigating different cultural contexts,
Hmm.
starting from your class experience growing up, as you described,
Hmm.
the experiences you had with your friends, and how that informed your desire to now pursue the field of equity. And now you're in the field of equity, working in the organizational context in the HR space. We're really looking at ways of transforming and creating healthier workplaces right now in the OPS. So with that, there's also the focus on leadership, definitely. And your experience with navigating cultural context is so important because right now, today, as you know, we're going to be talking about cultural intelligence, which is so key in terms of navigating those contexts. So let me ask you, Andre, what is cultural intelligence? What are some of its components?
I stepped into the space of cultural intelligence because We've been focused a lot on emotional intelligence and cultural competencies, especially in the leadership space. And I've always had this curiosity about what makes cultural intelligence different. And so when I was doing my initial research, I realized that cultural intelligence is actually the capability to function and relate effectively in culturally diverse domestic and international contexts. So, what that means is having CQ doesn't mean that working or visiting a country means that you actually have cultural intelligence. It's actually immersed in that in the culture. So, take for example, new immigrants coming to Canada. They're experiencing a whole different culture, whether it's work culture, where they live, how they live, and they're getting immersed to what that culture is like. But also at the same time, it's not for us as an example where, I would go to a country and, learn the language for a few days through Duolingo or whatever app there is these days. And that doesn't mean I'm culturally intelligent. Culturally intelligence, again, means that you actually live there, you're immersed in the culture, and you're fully fluent in how the cultures are. The other thing is that having technical competence does not necessarily mean having success. We talk so much about in a leadership space is having that technical understanding of what we do, whether it's policies, programs, etc. But we need to have a strategic mindset, a growth mindset. And this is what cultural intelligence does. And also, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things was about emotional intelligence. What we pride ourselves in having a high emotional intelligence to lead a team or lead a branch or department or ministry, etc. But that's not all it. It does not mean that you're successful in that role. You need to have that a different mindset, a global mindset, if you will. And also, having diversity doesn't necessarily equate to innovation. A high CQ or cultural intelligence will lead to that. So let's go deeper a little bit first. So, what does CQ entail? That's your question about the components. CQ is a scientifically proven framework and is based on four key capabilities that provide a model for measuring, enhancing, and applying CQ. First of all, there's the CQ drive. This is basically the motivational interest, the persistence and confidence during multicultural interactions. Secondly, CQ knowledge. It's having the knowledge of what multicultural interactions are all about. So understanding how cultures are similar or different. Let's, go back to my initial example of the Canadian experience. We call ourselves collectivists for the most part, with a mix of individualism, just depending on what part of the country you're in, um, versus the American side, the American rugged individualism that exists. So it's all about themselves. It's all about how do they succeed. If you want to go to a social media context, it's about, how many likes you get on Instagram or how many hits you get on social media. Third is the strategy now. This is based on a person's level of awareness and the ability to plan for multicultural interactions. And so now you're at that next stage. You've learned, you've been curious. So now, what do you do to plan for those interactions? Then finally, it's taking action. This is the behavioral component of whereby a person can adapt when relating to multicultural context. So, again, using the example of a new immigrant into the country, right? They're learning, they're adapting, and they're knowledgeable. But also, we have to do the same thing to them. How do we adapt to their cultures? It's not a one-way street, and this is where the OPS, they pride themselves about intercultural competence. This goes beyond that. So if you equate cultural competence with emotional intelligence, that would become the cultural intelligence model, if you will, because Q does not equal CQ. Cultural competence is the basic awareness of that. How do you immerse yourself into those cultures? And how do you fully understand them? So that is a two-way communication, intercultural communication between each other.
Thank you. Thank you, Andre. That was so, so, so elucidating. You really defined what cultural intelligence is in terms of the immersion, the cultural fluency, the immersion. So that's a key principle of that. And your examples were really great in terms of technical competency and what you said about intercultural competency just being an aspect of cultural intelligence and remaining capabilities have to come into play. So this is so important. Yeah, then I think just listening to you, that is the gap in terms of the challenge in terms of leadership in the OPS and what we're looking towards in terms of incorporating cultural intelligence into the leadership model and framework that we have right now. So just thanking you for that, making that very clear. So,
Mhm.
spoke about diversity, and of course, there's diversity, there's inclusion, there's equity. In that context, you said EQ, when we have that EQ, we can use that to lead a team. However, we also need more competencies around cultural intelligence so that we can actually have safer and healthier workplaces. So
Mhm.
there's the challenge of microaggressions, for example, in the workplace. There's the challenge in the context of recruitment. There's the challenge of, I would say, confirmation bias and that idea of cultural fit. So how does cultural intelligence foster diversity and inclusion in the workplace?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of people tend to not equate cultural intelligence with that. It actually does relate very heavily. And at its core, cultural intelligence in this case refers to the ability to function effectively across various cultural contexts. So it involves an understanding, a respect, and appreciation of the unique backgrounds and experiences of individuals. So again, uniqueness, intersectionality. How do we create those safe spaces so that they are able to thrive and survive, if you will, within our workplaces? And then with this cultural dexterity, if you will, organizations like the OPS would be better equipped to create an environment that welcomes different perspectives and opens up that dialogue. One of the things that we take pride in is in the OPS people plan right now is about creating that sense of belonging. What do we need to do to create that sense of belonging? We need to have that psychological safety, as you mentioned earlier, Valerian, um, in our workplaces. How does that transpire? And it's not just about someone having the safety to speak their minds or have that ability to provide their input into anything that's happening, right, to their managers, etc. The managers need to create that safe space. But then also managers, leaders, directors, etc., need to think about it from the other perspective, which is how can I create this safe space knowing that an individual came from a different culture? Cultural intelligence empowers organizations to realize the potential of diversity. Looking at that technical skills aspect, or even the strategic side of things, where employers can tap into a diverse range of skills, offer a broader set of solutions and innovations, which is kind of what I mentioned earlier. At the same time, culturally intelligent leadership helps provide those insights into different audiences and strengthening competitive dynamics, if you will. So we serve the residents of Ontario. The residents of Ontario are diverse. We have 10 or 15 million residents in the province in itself. And a lot of it, we're going to be at a point where the majority of residents are immigrants or new Canadians, if you will. So how do we tap into that, fully understand what we're doing? So yes, we do have the anti-racism action plan, but we need to take it a step further is how do we create those spaces for them to thrive in their own workplaces, in society, etc., so that culturally intelligent relationship would exist between residents of Ontario and through the policies that we deliver, through the programs that we deliver, and making sure that we're not only competent but intelligent of those populations.
Thank you. Not only competent, but intelligent. This is a major challenge. This, what you're describing is so, so, so complicated in terms of
Mhm,
how we can actually put this into practice. I hear everything you're saying in terms of the benefits for the organization and
mhm.
the challenge that we have to face based on the demographic shifts, which are hard trends that are definitely coming as we continue on this journey.
Yeah.
So we have to be ready for that. So I say, I hear you. There's a gap. There's a challenge coming in terms of demographic shifts, and these are some of the practices that can actually uh, help us in terms of navigating those challenges. So,
Mhm.
moving to that, in terms of navigating challenges, what is the major challenge facing ministries and equity teams? I know you've spoken to some of that already, but in
Mhm.
terms of
Mhm.
us focusing on core major challenges, what is the major
Yeah.
challenge facing ministries and equity teams in incorporating this cultural intelligence skill set into their inclusive leadership practice in the OPS?
Yeah, I've been in in OPS, and I've been in my career for a very long time. And the one thing that we've always heard is we have to be used to the way things are within the organization. And there's that resistance to change. And so that creates ingrained biases and misconceptions of people. And that becomes problematic, especially if we're not only trying to make our fellow OPSers thrive, especially those who come in from different cultures, but also those decisions end up being inaccurate, or they become inequitable, right? So you're not changing with the times. And so embracing cultural intelligence here, it requires an unlearning of certain preconceived notions about those cultures, because their cultures are going to be different from ours. And even though there's a whole bunch of unconscious biases, whether it's confirmation bias in terms of our hiring decisions or assumptions that we do, so we can already embed cultural intelligence into our processes, right? We can embed it in the way we think. So how do we get there? It requires a sustained effort to move beyond those traditional models of leadership. If you look at the 6 C's of inclusive leadership that Deloitte had put out back in 2016, we talk about collaboration, courage, uh, those areas. But yet, cultural intelligence is in that model, but is never really addressed in inclusive leadership. So that fits right into the inclusive leadership model that already exists within the OPS and the OPS leadership model. So, with that, it forms the values and integrates different cultural perspectives into that inclusive leadership model. And then going back to, for instance, the training and development that exists. How do we measure the efficacy of initiatives that promote cultural intelligence? And that also requires significant advancement into that. So this is not really upending the traditional models of L&D, if you will, but it's actually enhancing that. And it brings a layer to this challenge by bridging that gap between policies of promoting inclusion and lived reality of our employees and our fellow employees, if you will. And cultural intelligence, sure, it's scientific. It's something that's pried upon by Dr. David Livermore, who is pretty much, I wouldn't say he's the father of it, but he really embraces this, and I've learned from him through my CQ certification that I just recently obtained. And now for me, it's about putting this into practice. And so cultural intelligence should not be just a theory, but it's practice, as I said, and it's a valued aspect of the daily OPS leadership operations and its principles.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for giving us some clarity around how to look at that challenge of cultural intelligence and how we can actually incorporate that into the leadership practice so that
Mhm.
it can help to reduce the unconscious bias that you talked about. And
Mhm.
also, what you said, the major challenge is, as you described, the sustained effort to move beyond models of inclusive leadership that we have right now, actually
Mhm.
enhancing those models. So here we are now, we're looking at ways to bridge that gap. You talked about us looking at it from that policy lens in terms of what we can
Mhm.
do about our policies so that this can be incorporated into the leadership model. So thank you for that. I know you've mentioned that it's part of the 6 C's from the Deloitte model. So it's a component of inclusive leadership. And it's also a component of our own inclusive leadership model in the OPS that we can highlight more as we continue on this leadership practice. So if there was one thing that you'd like the audience to know about cultural intelligence, what would that be?
The one takeaway I would say about cultural intelligence with the work that we do is that it's not a static trait. Rather, it's a dynamic skill that can be nurtured and developed over time. whether it's the CQ drive, knowledge, strategy, action model, whether it's through the 6 C's of inclusive leadership that Deloitte has done. It's a skill that continues to thrive and people continue to learn and adapt. And adaptation, adaptive leadership is something that, I wouldn't even say so much adaptive leadership, but also agile leadership because of the way we are moving so quickly with technology, with people interacting with each other, that intercultural interactions, it's all happening so fast. And you'll never perfect cultural intelligence unless you practice it. So, the one thing I want to take away from this is Charles Kettering once said, the world hates change, yet it's the only thing that has brought us progress. The same principle applies to the development of cultural intelligence. So, to round this all off, cultural intelligence requires the curiosity and courage to question our biases, assumptions, and engage with different cultures in meaningful ways. And I mentioned earlier in that it isn't just about expanding our knowledge of different cultures, but developing empathy and mutual respect for humanity. It's a journey towards inclusivity, understanding, and actually ultimately progress.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So many gems of wisdom. Really appreciate you. Really thanking you for your expertise on this. You have a certification in cultural intelligence. So it really speaks to that reality that we can actually put this into our policies and practices. And in terms of the one thing, just thanking you for that. It's not a static trait, it's a dynamic trait that can be nurtured. So we really appreciate that. Also, what you said about this being a practice. So we continue to practice this and continue to practice this and practice those various components of the action model that you elucidated for. So thank you, Andre. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. And if there's anything else you want to add to this, is there anything else, Andre, on this?
It's a new concept. It's not a new theory, but it's new to the OPS in itself. A lot of people will think that cultural intelligence is made for multinational companies when they're interacting with different clients. It also applies to the local context. And I want people to go away when they're listening to this is that this work can apply to what we do every day in the OPS. It doesn't matter if we're in HR, if we are in a leadership position, if we are in a policy making position. It's a beneficial trait to have. And, like I said, it's not static. It's something that we have to put into practice. This is something that we should embrace and embed into our learning and development. One of the things that I take my pride on, if there's a learning and development opportunity to learn about this, I'm more than happy to have that conversation with L&D areas, or if they want to have a conversation that goes beyond and want to learn more about cultural intelligence, don't hesitate to contact me. I'm willing to be that individual that allows people to thrive in their environments using the culturally intelligent lens.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andre. Thank you for demonstrating that drive. Thank you for demonstrating that leadership, that's the strategy, taking those cultural intelligent actions as you continue to lead us in this context. So we really appreciate you, Andre. Thank you for your leadership. To our listeners, thank you for listening. Listening is part of leadership. Until next time, this is the Equity Series podcast.